There are moments in life that divide everything into before and after. Moments so profound, so utterly life-altering, that you can never again look at the world through the same eyes. For me, that moment came on a spring afternoon in Assisi, when my 12-year-old son pressed his trembling hand against the glass that separated him from a young saint, and everything changed. My name is Giuliana Montecchi, and this is the story of how I watched my son die slowly for months, only to witness him brought back to life by the intercession of Blessed Carlo Acutis. I need to tell you this story from the very beginning, because miracles do not happen in isolation. They are woven into the fabric of ordinary life, emerging from the depths of unbearable suffering, and they transform not just the person who receives them, but everyone who witnesses them. What happened to my son Lorenzo was not simply a medical anomaly or a fortunate turn of events. It was a miracle in the truest sense of the word, and I carry the weight and the glory of that truth with me every single day. Lorenzo was born on a crisp October morning in Bologna, Italy in 2007. He came into this world screaming with healthy lungs, his face red and furious, his tiny fists already clenched as if ready to fight for his place in life. From that very first moment, I knew he was special. Every mother thinks that about her child, of course. But with Lorenzo, it was something more. There was a light in his eyes, a curiosity, a hunger for life that set him apart from other children. I remember holding him for the first time, this tiny bundle of warmth and possibility, and feeling overwhelmed by a love so intense it frightened me. How could my heart contain so much? How could one small human being transform my entire existence in the span of a single breath? I pressed my lips to his forehead and whispered promises I intended to keep forever. I would protect him. I would nurture him. I would give him every opportunity to thrive and grow and become whoever he was meant to be. My husband Marco and I had tried for years to have a baby. We had suffered through 2 miscarriages, each one leaving a deeper wound in our hearts. When Lorenzo finally arrived, healthy and strong, we fell to our knees in gratitude. We baptized him at the Church of San Petronio in Bologna when he was just 3 weeks old, and I remember standing before the ancient baptismal font, tears streaming down my face, thanking God for this incredible gift. Lorenzo grew into a vibrant, energetic boy with his father's dark curly hair and my green eyes. He loved soccer with a passion that bordered on obsession, spending hours in our small backyard kicking a ball against the wall until the neighbors complained about the noise. He was bright in school, especially in mathematics, and his teachers often commented on his natural leadership abilities. But what I remember most about those early years was his laugh. Lorenzo had this infectious, full-bodied laugh that could fill an entire room with joy. When he laughed, you could not help but laugh along with him. He had a tender heart beneath his boisterous exterior. I remember how he would rescue earthworms from the sidewalk after rainstorms, carefully placing them back in the grass where they belonged. He adopted every stray cat that wandered into our neighborhood, giving them names and leaving out scraps of food until they disappeared again. When his grandmother was diagnosed with arthritis and could no longer knead bread, 10-year-old Lorenzo learned to do it for her, visiting her apartment every Saturday morning to help prepare the family's weekly loaves. There was a kindness in him that seemed innate, not taught. Marco and I often marveled at where it came from, this deep well of compassion that seemed to overflow from his small heart. Perhaps it was a gift, we thought. Perhaps God had blessed us with a child whose capacity for love was simply larger than most. Our life in Bologna was comfortable and happy. Marco worked as an engineer at a manufacturing company, and I taught elementary school at a public school near our apartment. We were not wealthy, but we had enough. We had each other. We had Lorenzo. And we had our faith, which we practiced faithfully every Sunday at our parish church. I suppose I should tell you that our faith, while sincere, was not extraordinary. We went to Mass. We said our prayers. We observed the holy days. But we were not the kind of Catholics who went on pilgrimages, or collected relics, or spent hours in Eucharistic adoration. We were ordinary believers, doing our best to live good lives and raise our son with solid values. If you had told me then that I would one day witness a miracle, I would have smiled politely and changed the subject. Miracles happened in the Bible, in the lives of saints, in distant lands and ancient times. They did not happen to school teachers from Bologna with unremarkable lives and modest faith. But God, as I would learn, has a way of breaking into ordinary lives with extraordinary grace. The first sign that something was wrong came in January of 2019, just a few weeks after Lorenzo's 12th birthday. He had been complaining of tiredness for a few days, which I attributed to the demands of returning to school after the Christmas holidays. Then he developed a low-grade fever that would not go away. I gave him children's ibuprofen and kept him home from school, assuming it was just a stubborn flu. But the fever persisted, and then I noticed the bruises. They appeared seemingly overnight, small purple marks on his arms and legs that he could not explain. Lorenzo was an active boy, always running and playing, so bruises were not unusual. But these were different. They appeared without any apparent cause, and they seemed to multiply daily. When I pressed on them gently, Lorenzo winced with pain. I took him to our family doctor, a kind older man named Dr. Benedetti, who had been treating our family for years. He examined Lorenzo carefully, his expression growing more serious with each passing minute. When he ordered blood tests, I felt the first cold fingers of fear grip my heart. The call came 2 days later. Dr. Benedetti's voice was grave as he asked us to come to his office immediately. Not in a few days, not when it was convenient. Immediately. Marco took the afternoon off work, and we drove to the clinic in silence, Lorenzo sitting in the back seat playing games on his phone, oblivious to the storm that was about to descend upon our lives. I remember looking at him in the rearview mirror, studying his face, trying to memorize every detail. Some part of me already knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Dr. Benedetti did not waste time with pleasantries. He sat us down in his office, handed us a cup of water, and told us that Lorenzo's blood work had come back with deeply concerning results. His white blood cell count was astronomically high. His red blood cells and platelets were dangerously low. The pattern was consistent with leukemia. I remember the word hitting me like a physical blow. Leukemia, cancer of the blood, the disease that had killed my aunt when I was just a teenager, the disease that had taken young Carlo Acutis at the age of 15, though I did not yet know who he was. The room seemed to tilt and spin around me. I gripped the armrests of my chair so hard my knuckles turned white, desperately trying to anchor myself to something solid as the world collapsed beneath my feet. This could not be happening. This was a mistake. They had mixed up the blood samples, confused Lorenzo's results with some other child's. My son was healthy. My son was fine. My son was going to play soccer this weekend and argue about homework and eat second helpings of pasta and live forever, because that is what children do. Children do not get cancer. Not my child. Not Lorenzo. But even as my mind screamed denials, I looked at Dr. Benedetti's face and saw the truth written there. This was no mistake. This was real. The monster I had never believed could find us had crashed through our door and wrapped its claws around my son's throat. Lorenzo looked up from his phone, confused by my sudden tears. Marco sat frozen beside me, his face drained of all color. Dr. Benedetti continued talking, explaining that we needed to see a specialist immediately, that there were different types of leukemia with different prognoses, that we should not lose hope. But his words seemed to come from very far away, muffled by the roaring in my ears. We were referred to the Sant'Orsola Malpighi Hospital in Bologna, one of the best medical centers in the region. Within a week, Lorenzo had undergone a bone marrow biopsy that confirmed our worst fears. He had acute lymphoblastic leukemia, an aggressive form of the disease that required immediate and intensive treatment. The oncologist, Dr. Alessandra Fabbri, was a tall woman with silver-streaked hair and kind but serious eyes. She sat us down in her office, surrounded by charts and medical books, and explained Lorenzo's situation with brutal honesty. The cancer was advanced. It had already spread significantly through his bone marrow. While acute lymphoblastic leukemia had a reasonably good survival rate in children, Lorenzo's particular case presented several concerning factors. His genetic markers suggested a more aggressive variant. His initial response to preliminary treatment was poor. She looked at us with compassion as she delivered the words that would haunt my nightmares for months to come. "I want to be honest with you," she said quietly. If Lorenzo does not respond to chemotherapy, if we cannot get this cancer into remission, we may be looking at a timeline of 6 months, perhaps less. 6 months. My son, my beautiful, laughing, soccer-loving son, might have only 6 months to live. I do not remember leaving the hospital that day. I do not remember the drive home or putting Lorenzo to bed or the conversation Marco and I had late into the night. Shock has a way of erasing memories, of creating blank spaces where unbearable moments should be. What I do remember is waking up the next morning and, for one brief, beautiful second, forgetting everything. Then the memories came crashing back like a tidal wave, and I understood that this nightmare was real. The chemotherapy began almost immediately. Lorenzo was admitted to the pediatric oncology ward at Sant'Orsola, a cheerfully decorated unit that tried desperately to disguise the horrors taking place within its walls. The nurses were wonderful, patient and gentle with the children, but no amount of kindness could mask the reality of what was happening. I watched my son's beautiful curly hair fall out in clumps. I held his hand as he vomited for hours after each treatment. I lay beside him in his narrow hospital bed, listening to him cry from pain and fear and confusion. He was 12 years old. He should have been playing soccer with his friends, arguing with his teachers, developing his first crush. Instead, he was fighting for his life against an enemy he could not see or understand. There were moments of such profound helplessness that I thought I might shatter into 1,000 pieces. I would sit in the hospital corridor at 3 in the morning, unable to sleep, watching the nurses move quietly from room to room, and I would feel the weight of my own powerlessness crushing me like a physical force. I was his mother. I was supposed to protect him from everything that could hurt him. I had kissed his scraped knees and bandaged his small wounds and chased away the monsters that hid in his closet. But I could not kiss this better. I could not bandage his cancer. I could not chase away the monster that lived in his own blood. Marco tried to be strong for both of us, but I could see him crumbling. He would leave the hospital room to take phone calls from work, and sometimes I would find him in the stairwell, sobbing so hard he could barely breathe. We clung to each other in those dark days, 2 drowning people trying desperately to keep each other afloat. But the waters kept rising, and our strength kept failing. The first round of chemotherapy did not work. Dr. Fabry tried to remain optimistic, explaining that it often took multiple approaches to find the right treatment protocol. But I could see the concern in her eyes, the slight furrow in her brow when she examined Lorenzo's latest blood work. The cancer was not responding. It was continuing to spread, continuing to destroy my son from the inside out. Marco and I took turns staying at the hospital. One of us was always by Lorenzo's side while the other went home to shower, to rest, to maintain some semblance of normal life. But there was no normal anymore. I could not focus on my teaching. I could not eat. I could barely sleep. Every moment away from Lorenzo felt like a betrayal, and every moment with him felt like watching an hourglass slowly empty. My faith, which had always been a source of comfort, began to waver. I found myself unable to pray, unable to find words to address a God who would allow a 12-year-old boy to suffer like this. What had Lorenzo done to deserve this? What had we done? I had always believed that God was loving and just. But where was his love now? Where was his justice? One night, about 3 months into Lorenzo's treatment, I broke down completely. I was sitting in the hospital chapel, an ugly little room with fluorescent lighting and plastic chairs, and I screamed at God. I screamed at him for the injustice of it all, for the cruelty of taking a child, for the silence that met my desperate prayers. I told him that if he let my son die, I would never forgive him. I would never set foot in a church again. I would spend the rest of my life cursing his name. It was not my finest spiritual moment, but it was honest. And somehow, in the depths of my rage and despair, I felt something shift. Not an answer exactly, but a presence. A sense that I was not screaming into a void, that someone was listening, even if he chose not to respond in words. The second round of chemotherapy was even more brutal than the first. Lorenzo grew thinner and weaker with each passing day. His skin took on a grayish pallor, and dark circles appeared under his eyes. He stopped asking when he could go home. stopped talking about the soccer games he was missing. He seemed to be retreating into himself, conserving whatever energy he had left for the simple act of survival. By April of 2019, Dr. Fabry sat us down for another difficult conversation. The treatments were not working. Lorenzo's cancer was continuing to progress. There was one more protocol they could try, an experimental combination of drugs that had shown some promise in similar cases. But she wanted us to understand the reality of the situation. If this did not work, there were no more options. We would be looking at palliative care, at making Lorenzo comfortable for whatever time he had left. 6 months, she had said back in January. It was now April. We had already used up more than half of the time she had given us, and Lorenzo was getting worse, not better. I do not know how I survived those days. I moved through them like a ghost, going through the motions of life while my heart slowly shattered into a million pieces. I watched other children in the oncology ward get better, go home, return to normal lives, and I watched others die, their small bodies carried out under white sheets while their parents collapsed in grief. I knew that would be us soon. I knew that I would be the mother weeping in the hallway, that I would be planning a funeral instead of a future. It was during this darkest period that I first heard the name Carlo Acutis. I was sitting in the hospital waiting room, numbly scrolling through my phone while Lorenzo underwent yet another round of tests. A woman sat down beside me, another mother whose daughter was being treated for a brain tumor. We had nodded at each other in the hallways for weeks, but had never really spoken. Tragedy has a way of isolating people, of making us retreat into our private hells. But that day, she struck up a conversation. She told me about her daughter, about the fear and the hope and the exhaustion, and then she asked if I had ever heard of Carlo Acutis. I shook my head. The name meant nothing to me. She pulled out her phone and showed me a picture of a dark-haired teenage boy with a gentle smile and bright, intelligent eyes. She told me his story. Carlo Acutis was a young Italian boy from Milan who had died in 2006 at the age of 15 from acute promyelocytic leukemia, the same category of disease that was killing my son. But what made Carlo special was not his death, but his life. He had been a devout Catholic from an early age, developing an intense devotion to the Eucharist that led him to attend Mass daily and spend hours in adoration. He had used his considerable computer skills to create a website documenting Eucharistic miracles around the world, a project that had touched millions of lives. The woman's eyes grew soft as she continued speaking, her voice taking on a reverent quality that I would later come to understand. Carlo was not like other teenagers, she said. He was modern in every way, loved video games, loved computers, loved the internet, but he was also deeply, profoundly in love with Jesus Christ. He called the Eucharist his highway to heaven. He would say that the Eucharist was his center and that without Jesus, he could do nothing. I found myself leaning forward, captivated despite my skepticism. There was something about this boy's story that resonated deep within me, some chord being struck that I had not known existed. He died so young, the woman continued, just 15 years old. When the doctors diagnosed him with leukemia, he accepted it with incredible peace. He offered his suffering for the Pope and for the Church. He never complained, never asked why God had allowed this to happen to him. He simply said, "I offer all the suffering I will have to endure to the Lord, for the Pope, and for the Church." After his death, stories began to emerge of miraculous healings attributed to his intercession. A young Brazilian boy with a severe pancreatic defect had been healed after praying to Carlo. The Catholic Church had taken notice, and the process for his beatification was well underway. His body had been exhumed in 2019 and found to be remarkably preserved. It was now displayed in a glass case at the Sanctuary of the Renunciation in Assisi, where thousands of pilgrims came to pray. The woman looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I'm taking my daughter to Assisi next week," she said. "We're going to pray at his tomb. I don't know if it will help, but I have to try. I have to believe that miracles are still possible." I thanked her politely and wished her well, but I did not take her story seriously. I was too angry at God, too exhausted by months of watching my son suffer, to believe in miracles. Carlo Acutis was just another dead teenager, another victim of the same cruel disease that was killing Lorenzo. How could he help my son when he could not even save himself? But the name stayed with me. Carlo Acutis. I found myself thinking about him during the long nights at Lorenzo's bedside, during the endless hours of waiting for test results. I looked him up on my phone, reading about his life, his faith, his remarkable devotion to the Eucharist. I saw pictures of his tomb in Assisi, his preserved body dressed in jeans and sneakers, looking for all the world like he was simply sleeping. And something stirred in my heart. Not faith, exactly, not hope, but something like curiosity, like a door opening just a crack to let in a sliver of light. The experimental treatment began in late April. It was even more aggressive than the previous protocols, leaving Lorenzo weak and nauseated and barely able to lift his head from the pillow. But Dr. Fabri remained cautiously optimistic. The early indicators were slightly better than before. There was a chance, however slim, that this might work. 2 weeks into the treatment, Lorenzo developed a severe infection that nearly killed him. His immune system, battered by months of chemotherapy, could not fight off the bacteria that had invaded his bloodstream. He was moved to the intensive care unit, hooked up to machines and monitors, his small body fighting a war on multiple fronts. Marco and I were told to prepare for the worst. The chaplain came to administer the last rites, but Lorenzo survived. Barely. He pulled through the infection, though it left him weaker than ever. And when Dr. Fabri came to see us a few days later, her expression told me everything I needed to know before she even spoke. The experimental treatment had failed. Lorenzo's cancer was still advancing. There was nothing more they could do. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "We'll keep him comfortable. We'll manage his pain. But you should start thinking about making memories, about saying goodbye." I do not remember what happened after that. I think I screamed. I think Marco had to hold me back from attacking the doctor, from demanding that she try something else, anything else. I think I collapsed on the floor of the hospital corridor and wept until I had no tears left. That night I sat alone in the hospital chapel, the same ugly little room where I had screamed at God months before. But I had no screams left. I had no anger left. I had nothing but a vast, empty despair that stretched out before me like an endless desert. And then, without really meaning to, I began to pray. Not to God. I could not bring myself to address him directly, but to Carlo Acutis, this teenager who had died of the same disease that was killing my son. This young saint who had supposedly performed miracles from beyond the grave. "If you're real," I whispered into the empty room. "If you can really help people, please help my son. Please don't let him die. He's only 12 years old. He has his whole life ahead of him. Please, Carlo. Please." I felt nothing. No presence, no peace, no sign that my prayers had been heard. But I kept praying anyway, night after night, pouring out my desperate hope to this boy I had never met. A week later, I made a decision. We were going to Assisi. Marco thought I had lost my mind. Lorenzo was too weak to travel, too sick to leave the hospital. The doctors would never allow it. But I was beyond reason, beyond logic. Something was driving me toward Assisi, toward Carlo Acutis, toward the last desperate hope I had left. To my surprise, Dr. Fabri did not try to stop us. "There's nothing more we can do here," she said gently. "If this brings you comfort, if it gives Lorenzo some peace, then go. Just be careful, and come back if anything changes." We left the hospital on a gray morning in mid-May. Lorenzo was so weak that we had to rent a special van with a bed in the back so he could lie down during the journey. He weighed almost nothing when I lifted him, his body reduced to skin and bones by months of illness. But when I told him where we were going, when I showed him pictures of Carlo Acutis and explained what we were hoping to do, a small light appeared in his eyes. "I want to meet him," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to meet the boy who talked to Jesus." The drive from Bologna to Assisi takes about 3 hours under normal circumstances. We took nearly 5, stopping frequently so Lorenzo could rest, so I could check on him, so we could all catch our breath. The Italian countryside rolled past our windows, green and beautiful in the spring sunshine. and I found myself thinking about all the journeys we had taken as a family. The summer trips to the coast, the ski vacations in the Alps, the weekend visits to Marco's parents in Tuscany. Would this be our last journey together? Would my son die in Assisi, far from home, chasing a miracle that would never come? The landscape of Umbria unfolded before us like a painting by one of the old masters. Rolling hills covered with olive groves and vineyards, ancient stone farmhouses perched on distant ridges, cypress trees standing like dark sentinels along winding country roads. It was beautiful beyond description, this land that had birthed so many saints, and I felt something stirring in my heart that I could not quite name. Lorenzo slept for most of the journey, his thin body curled beneath blankets in the back of the van. Every few minutes I would turn around to check on him, to make sure he was still breathing, to reassure myself that he had not slipped away while I was not looking. The fear of losing him had become a constant companion, a shadow that followed me everywhere I went. Marco drove in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. I knew he did not share my fragile hope. He had come on this journey for me, for Lorenzo, not because he believed anything miraculous would happen. He was a practical man, an engineer who believed in facts and formulas and measurable outcomes. But he loved his son with a fierce, protective love, and he would have driven to the ends of the earth if there was even the smallest chance it might help. But I pushed those thoughts away. I had to believe. I had to hope. If I lost hope, I had nothing left. We arrived in Assisi in the late afternoon. The medieval town rose before us on its hill, crowned by the great Basilica of St. Francis, its stone buildings glowing golden in the fading light. I had visited Assisi once before, as a teenager on a school trip, and I remembered being moved by its beauty and peace. But now, seeing it through the eyes of a desperate mother, it seemed almost otherworldly, like a place suspended between heaven and earth. We found a small hotel near the center of town, and the owner, a kind elderly woman named Signora Battaglia, took one look at Lorenzo and immediately set about making him comfortable. She brought him warm soup and fresh bread. She put extra blankets on his bed. She told him stories about St. Francis and the miracles that had happened in this holy place. Lorenzo listened with wide eyes, too tired to respond, but clearly drinking in every word. That night, I sat by his bedside and watched him sleep. His breathing was shallow and labored, his skin pale as paper, his thin hands lying still on the white sheets. He looked like a ghost, like a boy already halfway to heaven, and I prayed again to Carlo Acutis, begging him for a miracle, promising anything, everything, if only he would save my son. The next morning, we made our way to the sanctuary of the Renunciation. It was a small church, not as grand as the great basilica, but it held something infinitely more precious. In a side chapel, behind a glass panel, lay the body of Carlo Acutis. The morning air was cool and fragrant with the scent of spring flowers as we made our way through the narrow medieval streets. Assisi was beginning to wake, shopkeepers opening their shutters, church bells ringing the morning hour, pilgrims making their way toward the various holy sites that dotted the ancient city. There was a peaceful energy here, a sense of something sacred permeating the very stones beneath our feet. Lorenzo was quiet in his wheelchair, his eyes taking in everything around him with an intensity I had not seen in months. He seemed more alert than he had been in weeks, as if the very atmosphere of Assisi was having some effect on him that I could not explain. When we reached the sanctuary of the Renunciation, I paused outside the door, suddenly overcome with emotion. This was it. This was the moment I had been praying for, hoping for, desperately reaching toward through all those long, dark nights at the hospital. Whatever happened inside this small church, whatever we found or did not find, nothing would be the same afterward. Marco squeezed my hand and nodded toward the entrance. Together, we pushed Lorenzo's wheelchair through the ancient wooden doors and into the cool, quiet interior. I had seen pictures online, but nothing prepared me for the reality of seeing him in person. He looked like he was sleeping, this teenage boy in his jeans and sneakers, his hands folded peacefully across his chest. His face was serene, almost smiling, as if he were dreaming pleasant dreams. It seemed impossible that he had been dead for 13 years, that his body had been buried and exhumed and preserved. He looked so alive, so present, so close. The chapel was quiet when we arrived, with only a few other pilgrims kneeling in prayer. We approached the glass case slowly, Marco pushing Lorenzo in a wheelchair we had borrowed from the hotel. Lorenzo's eyes were fixed on Carlo's face, filled with wonder and something that looked almost like recognition. "He looks like a normal kid," Lorenzo whispered, "like someone I might know from school." I knelt beside the wheelchair, taking my son's thin hand in mine. "He was a normal kid," I said. "He played video games and had a dog named Briciola. He went to school and did his homework and got in trouble sometimes, but he also loved Jesus more than anything in the world. And he still helps people, even from heaven." Lorenzo was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving Carlo's face. Then he turned to me with a determination I had not seen in months. "I want to touch him," he said. "Can I touch the glass?" There was a small opening at the bottom of the display case, a space where pilgrims could reach through to touch the base of Carlo's tomb. The opening was not large, but Lorenzo's hand had grown so thin that it could easily fit through. Marco lifted Lorenzo from the wheelchair and carried him to the glass case. Lorenzo was trembling, whether from weakness or emotion I could not tell. He reached out his skeletal hand, stretched it through the opening, and pressed his palm against the cold glass that separated him from Carlo's body. I held my breath. The entire chapel seemed to hold its breath. Time itself seemed to pause, waiting, watching, wondering what would happen next. What happened next is something I will never forget, something I will carry with me until the day I die. Lorenzo closed his eyes and his face changed. The pain that had been his constant companion for months seemed to melt away. A look of peace, of profound serenity, settled over his features. His breathing, which had been shallow and strained, became deep and even. And then, softly, he began to cry. But these were not tears of sadness. They were tears of joy, of relief, of something beyond my understanding. He kept his hand pressed against the glass for what felt like an eternity, his lips moving in silent prayer, his entire being seemingly absorbed into the presence of Carlo Acutis. I watched my son in that holy moment, and I felt something shift in the very fabric of reality around us. The air in the chapel grew warmer, or perhaps it was my imagination. The light streaming through the stained glass windows seemed to intensify, casting rainbow patterns across the stone floor. And there was a presence in that place, something tangible yet invisible, something that pressed against my heart with a weight of love so enormous I could barely contain it. Later, Lorenzo would tell me what he experienced during those minutes with his hand on the glass. He said he felt warmth spreading through his body, starting from his palm and flowing outward until it reached every cell, every fiber of his being. He said he heard a voice, not with his ears, but somewhere deeper, a voice that spoke words of comfort and healing and love. He said he saw Carlo's face, not the preserved face behind the glass, but a living, radiant face smiling at him from somewhere beyond the boundaries of this world. I do not know what to make of these claims. I am not a mystic. I do not have visions or hear heavenly voices, but I know what I saw with my own eyes. I saw my dying son touch a saint's tomb and be transformed, and that is enough for me. I was crying too, though I did not realize it until I felt the tears dropping onto my clasped hands. Marco had fallen to his knees beside me, his face buried in his hands. The other pilgrims in the chapel had stopped their prayers to watch, sensing that something extraordinary was happening. And then Lorenzo opened his eyes. I gasped when I saw them. The dull, exhausted look that had clouded his gaze for months was gone. His eyes were bright, clear, alive with an intensity I had not seen since before his diagnosis. He looked at me and smiled. A real smile. The first genuine smile I had seen from him in what felt like forever. "Mama," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "I feel different. I feel warm, like someone is hugging me from the inside." I could not speak. I could only stare at my son, my dying son, who suddenly did not look like he was dying anymore. Marco helped Lorenzo back into the wheelchair, and we sat in that chapel for hours. We prayed. We wept. We watched other pilgrims come and go, each one approaching Carlo's tomb with their own hopes and fears and desperate prayers. And throughout it all, Lorenzo remained calm and peaceful, his hand occasionally reaching toward the glass as if maintaining a connection with the boy who lay behind it. That evening, back at the hotel, Lorenzo ate a full meal for the first time in months. He asked for seconds. He sat up in bed and talked animatedly about Carlo Acutis, about the saints, about heaven and miracles and the mysteries of faith. He looked like a different child, like the Lorenzo I remembered from before the illness, vibrant and curious and full of life. I wanted to believe. Oh, how I wanted to believe. But I had been disappointed too many times. I had watched too many false hopes crumble into dust. I told myself that it was adrenaline, that it was the emotional intensity of the experience, that Lorenzo would wake up tomorrow just as sick as before. But he did not. The next morning, Lorenzo got out of bed by himself for the first time in weeks. He walked, unsteadily but on his own 2 feet, to the window and looked out at the medieval streets of Assisi. He ate breakfast with appetite and energy, chatting with Signora Battaglia about her cats and her garden and her grandchildren. He asked if we could visit the Basilica of St. Francis, if we could climb to the top of the town, if we could stay in Assisi forever. I called Dr. Fabri from the hotel lobby, my hands shaking as I held the phone. I described what I was seeing, the transformation in Lorenzo's energy and appetite and spirit. She listened in silence, and when I finished, she said simply, "Bring him back, immediately. We need to run tests." We drove home that same day, Lorenzo sitting up in the back of the van, looking out the window at the passing countryside, asking questions and making observations and behaving like a normal, healthy 12-year-old boy. Marco and I kept exchanging glances in the rearview mirror, afraid to speak, afraid to hope, afraid to break whatever spell had fallen over our son. The tests began as soon as we arrived at Sant'Orsola. Blood work, bone marrow biopsy, CT scans, PET scans. Dr. Fabri ordered every diagnostic test available, her face a mask of professional composure that could not quite hide her underlying confusion. The waiting was almost unbearable. After everything we had been through, after the impossible events in Assisi, to sit in hospital waiting rooms once again felt like a cruel joke. But this time was different. This time, Lorenzo sat beside me reading a book about St. Francis, eating snacks from the vending machine, talking animatedly about everything and nothing. He was not the ghost child who had left this hospital just days before. He was alive, vibrant, overflowing with energy and hope. The nurses who had cared for him during his treatment kept stopping by to see him, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had watched him declining for months, had held his hand during the worst of the chemotherapy, had secretly prepared themselves for the inevitable end. Now here he was, walking the corridors, laughing at silly jokes, asking when he could go home. "It's not possible," one nurse whispered to another when she thought I was not listening. "I've never seen anything like it. This boy was dying. He was days away from hospice care. And now look at him." I looked at him, and I thanked God with every breath. 3 days later, she called us into her office. I will remember her expression until the day I die. She looked stunned, bewildered, like someone who had just witnessed the impossible. She sat us down, took a deep breath, and told us the results. The cancer was gone. Not in remission. Not suppressed by treatment. Gone. Completely. Entirely. Inexplicably gone. Lorenzo's blood work was normal. His bone marrow was healthy. There was no trace of the disease that had been killing him just days before. "I have no explanation for this," Dr. Fabri said, her voice trembling. "This is not how leukemia works. Cancer does not just disappear overnight. The treatments we gave him were not working. He was getting worse, not better. And now," she shook her head, struggling to find words. "I have been a doctor for 25 years. I have never seen anything like this." Marco grabbed my hand so hard I thought he might break it. I could not breathe. I could not think. I could only stare at this woman, this scientist, this rational medical professional, as she told me that my son was healed. "We'll need to run more tests," she continued. We'll need to monitor him closely for the foreseeable future. But based on everything I'm seeing, Lorenzo is cancer-free. Whatever happened in Assisi, whatever you did there, it worked. What happened next is a blur of tears and laughter and disbelief. I remember falling to my knees in the hospital corridor, sobbing with gratitude, calling out Carlo's name over and over. I remember Marco lifting Lorenzo into his arms and spinning him around, both of them laughing like children. I remember the nurses rushing over, confused and concerned, then joining in our celebration when they heard the news. And I remember, later that night, kneeling alone in the hospital chapel and thanking God, not screaming at him this time, not demanding answers or making accusations, just thanking him, simply and purely, for the miracle he had worked through his young servant Carlo Acutis. The days that followed were filled with tests and examinations and consultations with specialists from across Italy. Everyone wanted to examine Lorenzo, to study his case, to find a scientific explanation for his impossible recovery. They poked and prodded and scanned him from every angle, looking for some hidden variable, some overlooked factor that could account for what had happened. They found nothing. There was no medical explanation. Lorenzo's cancer had simply vanished, as if it had never existed. Word of the healing spread quickly through the hospital. Nurses who had cared for Lorenzo during his darkest days came to see him, weeping with joy as they witnessed his transformation. Other parents from the oncology ward sought us out, desperate to hear our story, to know what we had done, to find hope for their own suffering children. I told them about Carlo Acutis. I told them about Assisi. I told them about the moment Lorenzo touched the glass and everything changed. Some of them believed me. Others did not. But all of them listened. And several of them made their own pilgrimages to the sanctuary of the Renunciation in the weeks that followed. Lorenzo was discharged from the hospital in early June, exactly 5 months after his diagnosis. Dr. Fabri walked us to the entrance, her eyes glistening with tears she was trying very hard not to shed. "I don't know what to write in my final report," she admitted. Spontaneous remission? Unexplained recovery? Nothing in my medical training has prepared me for this. She looked at Lorenzo, who was practically bouncing with energy after months of being confined to a hospital bed. "Whatever you believe happened, whatever explanation you find comfort in, I'm just grateful. This boy deserves to live a long and happy life." I hugged her. This woman who had done everything in her power to save my son, who had faced the limits of her science with honesty and compassion. "Thank you," I said. "Thank you for trying. Thank you for not giving up." She smiled. "I didn't save him, Signora Montecchi. Something else did. Someone else." She glanced upward, toward the ceiling, toward heaven. I'm not a particularly religious woman, but after seeing this, I might have to reconsider. The summer of 2019 was the happiest of our lives. Lorenzo grew stronger every day, his body rebuilding itself with astonishing speed. His hair grew back, thick and curly as before. His appetite returned with a vengeance, and I spent hours in the kitchen preparing his favorite meals, grateful beyond words for the simple pleasure of feeding my hungry child. We took him to the coast that August, to a small beach town on the Adriatic where we had vacationed when he was younger. I watched him run across the sand, dive into the waves, play beach volleyball with other children, and I wept. These were tears of joy this time, the sweetest tears I had ever shed. My son was alive. My son was healthy. My son was splashing in the sea while the summer sun blazed overhead and everything was right with the world. Marco began to believe. Slowly, reluctantly, but undeniably. He had watched his son die and come back to life, and even his engineer's mind could not explain away what had happened. One evening, as we sat on the beach watching Lorenzo chase seagulls along the waterline, he turned to me and said something he had never said before. "I think I need to go to confession," he said quietly. "I haven't been in years, but after everything that's happened, I think I need to talk to God. I think I need to thank him." We went together the next day to a small church in the village. I waited outside while Marco spent nearly an hour with the priest. When he emerged, his eyes were red from crying, but there was a peace in his face that I had never seen before. Our family had been broken by suffering. We had been rebuilt by grace. He returned to school in September, a full year behind his classmates, but determined to catch up. His friends welcomed him back with cheers and hugs, and within weeks, it was as if he had never been gone. He rejoined his soccer team, starting slowly but gradually regaining his strength and skill. By Christmas, he was scoring goals and celebrating victories, his joyful laugh echoing across the field. But Lorenzo was not the same boy he had been before his illness. The experience had changed him in ways that went far beyond the physical. He had developed a deep, sincere faith that expressed itself in daily prayer and regular attendance at Mass. He asked to receive communion frequently, often dragging reluctant Marco and me to weekday services at our parish church. He read voraciously about the saints, filling his bedroom with books and icons and pictures of holy men and women throughout history. And his devotion to Carlo Acutis was absolute. Lorenzo kept a picture of Carlo on his nightstand, right next to his soccer trophies and school photos. He prayed to him every night, thanking him for the miracle, asking for his continued intercession, promising to live a life worthy of the gift he had received. He started his own website, inspired by Carlo's example, documenting stories of faith and hope from around the world. In October of 2020, we returned to Assisi for Carlo's beatification. Lorenzo stood in the crowd outside the Basilica of St. Francis, tears streaming down his face, as Pope Francis's delegate declared Carlo Acutis blessed. It was a moment of profound joy and gratitude, a celebration not just of Carlo's holiness, but of the miracle he had worked in our own lives. The ceremony was beautiful beyond description. Thousands of pilgrims had gathered from all over the world, filling the plaza before the great basilica, spilling into the narrow streets of the medieval town. Many of them had their own stories of healing, their own testimonies of Carlo's intercession, their own reasons for traveling to this sacred place to honor the teenage saint. I looked around at all those faces, at all those lives touched by Carlo Acutis, and I felt a profound sense of communion. We were connected, all of us, by the threads of faith and hope and miraculous love. We had each walked our own path of suffering, and we had each found our way to the same destination. We were witnesses to something greater than ourselves, something that transcended the boundaries of time and space and mortality. The cardinal presiding over the ceremony spoke about Carlo's life, his virtues, his heroic faith. He spoke about the miracles attributed to Carlo's intercession, the lives saved and transformed by his heavenly prayers. And I thought about my own son, standing beside me, living proof that the age of miracles was not over. Lorenzo asked to approach the tomb again after the ceremony. We waited in line for hours, surrounded by thousands of other pilgrims, all of them drawn by the same faith, the same hope, the same longing for divine intervention in their own troubled lives. When we finally reached the glass case, Lorenzo knelt and placed his hand on the barrier that separated him from his heavenly friend. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for showing me what really matters. I promise I won't waste this gift. I promise I'll live for Jesus just like you did." I watched my son pray, this boy who should have been dead, who should have been buried in a cemetery in Bologna, who should have been nothing but a fading memory and a permanent ache in my heart. And I wept with gratitude for the miracle that had brought him back to us. It has been several years now since Lorenzo's healing. He is a young man, tall and strong, pursuing his studies with passion and purpose. He wants to become a doctor, he says, so he can help other children who are facing what he faced. He wants to bring hope to families in despair, to be an instrument of healing in a world that desperately needs it. Last year, he was accepted into the medical program at the University of Bologna. The same hospital that could not save his life will now train him to save others. There is a beautiful symmetry in that, a divine poetry that speaks to God's sense of justice and redemption. Lorenzo never takes a single day for granted. He wakes up each morning with gratitude, goes to bed each night with prayer, and fills the hours in between with purpose and meaning. The boy who was given 6 months to live has already far exceeded that timeline, and he intends to keep exceeding it for many decades to come. He still visits Assisi regularly, still prays to Carlo Acutis every day, still carries the memory of that miraculous moment in his heart. and he shares his story with anyone who will listen, not for glory or attention, but because he believes that miracles are possible, that God still intervenes in the lives of his children, that hope should never be abandoned even in the darkest circumstances. Marco and I watch our son with a mixture of pride and awe. The boy we nearly lost has become a young man of extraordinary faith and compassion. The illness that should have destroyed him instead transformed him into something beautiful, something luminous, something that reflects the love of God to everyone he meets. As for me, I am a different woman than I was before all of this happened. My faith, which once wavered under the weight of suffering, has been transformed into something unshakable. I no longer doubt that God hears our prayers. I no longer question whether miracles are possible. I have seen one with my own eyes, lived through one with my own heart, and that experience has changed everything. I still teach elementary school in Bologna. I still go to Mass on Sundays with my husband. I still live an ordinary life in an ordinary city. But I carry within me the knowledge that ordinary life can be interrupted at any moment by extraordinary grace, that heaven is closer than we think, that the saints are not distant figures from ancient history, but living presences who continue to intercede for us from beyond the veil. Carlo Acutis died at 15, younger than my son is now. His life was brief by any measure, a candle extinguished far too soon. But in that brief life, he achieved something that most of us never will. He became a beacon of faith, a channel of miracles, a bridge between heaven and earth, and he saved my son's life. I do not know why Lorenzo was chosen for this miracle when so many other children continue to suffer and die. I do not know why our prayers were answered when others go unanswered. These are mysteries beyond my understanding, questions that I will never be able to resolve this side of heaven. All I know is that my son was dying, and now he lives. My son was without hope, and now he overflows with it. My son touched the tomb of a teenage saint, and everything changed. If you are watching this and you are in despair, if you are facing an impossible situation with no way out, if you have lost faith in God and in miracles and in hope itself, I want you to know that I understand. I have been where you are. I have screamed at heaven and cursed God's name and believed that all was lost. But I also want you to know that miracles are real. They still happen. They happen to my son, and they can happen to you. Do not give up. Do not lose hope. Pray to Carlo Acutis. Visit his tomb if you can. Reach out to this young saint who still reaches back from heaven with hands full of grace. My name is Giuliana Montecchi. My son Lorenzo was given 6 months to live. He touched the tomb of Carlo Acutis, and he was healed. This is our story, and it is true, and I will spend the rest of my life proclaiming it to anyone who will listen. Because miracles happen, because saints are real, because hope is never lost as long as heaven still hears our prayers. And Carlo Acutis is listening. If this story touched your heart, ask for the intercession of Blessed Carlo Acutis in your prayers. Subscribe to this channel, leave your like, and hit the notification bell for more stories that inspire our faith.